haven't seen it. Yeah, for sort of, if you come to the house and you're going
to So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming inside either to our Nature Learning Center or for those of you joining us online for going inside to your homes to join us on this first, sort of very lovely warm spring day in April, to remind myself what month it is. My name's Nora Dufalo. I'm the program director here at Tin Mountain Conservation Center. And before I introduced tonight's presenter, I want to take a moment first to thank Tin Mountain's Nature Program Series sponsors. They are White Mountain Oil and Propane, Hancock Lumber, and most recently Farm to Table Market in West Ossipee. So I want to recognize them for their financial contributions that allow their support that allows us to put on our quality programming such as this. I also want to thank those of you who are watching who are current members of Tin Mountain Conservation Center, because your membership dollars go to helping us fulfill our mission, including public programming such as this. So thank you to all of our members. If you're not a member, we would certainly encourage you to consider doing so. And you can find information on that on our website, tinmountain.org. I also want to put in a plug for a few upcoming programs that we have. Our next program that we have is actually, this is a departure from our norm, because normally our evening programs are on Thursday evenings, but we like to keep people on their toes. So this coming Wednesday, April 19th, actually up in Jackson at the Whitney Community Center at 7 o'clock, we have our very own Logan Anderson, our resident bird intern, is presenting on bird-friendly yards. So sort of how to encourage wildlife, those avian wildlife to your yard. So that should be a fabulous program. Again, that's up in Jackson. In person, we also don't have a date yet, but we, as the weather warms up, I know that we see crocuses coming out and we see the daffodils starting to bloom. So that is a reminder that our spring ephemerals, or our pop-up spring wildflower program, is coming up. We never really know the date of that until a few days before. We are anticipating it'll be somewhere in the April 24th to May 5th window, sort of those 2 weeks. And if that's something that you're interested in joining us on, normally that is around the Humphreys Ledge area, off West Side Road in North Conway. You can give us a call or give me an email, and we'll put you on the on-call list. And as soon as we set the date for that, we'll send out that information to folks interested, and you can let us know if you're able to join us. And again, because as things are melting and opening up, we also have not this Saturday, but next Saturday, April 22nd, our annual Ducks and Donuts program. We provide the donuts. Hopefully the old course of the soccer provides the ducks. But that is always a fun exploration in the Freiburg area, looking for various ducks and waterfowl. So that is on Saturday, April 22nd. So a number of fun upcoming programs. There is more information and registration instructions on our website, tinmountain.org. But we've come here today not to talk about wildflowers or about birds, but a group of animals and a particular species that we don't hear about a lot here in New Hampshire. and that is the timber rattlesnake. And we are very excited to have Brendan Clifford, a wildlife biologist with New Hampshire Fish and Game. We are always appreciative of the New Hampshire Fish and Game biologists who are so incredibly knowledgeable that, you know, when they come out and will speak on topics. Brendan monitored New Hampshire's rattlesnake population for over 17 years, and he is going to share, you know, some of the life history, you know, historic range, and the current monitoring and management of these animals. So I'm going to hand things over to Brendan. The last thing I will say is that if you have questions, we encourage you to save them till the end. If you are watching online, I would encourage you to use the chat feature, and I will be monitoring that, and I will ask those questions at the end. And with that, I'll hand things over to Brendan.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. It's my first time up at this center. It's a beautiful place. And I'm excited to talk about a snake that a lot of people don't even realize that we have in New Hampshire. The timber rattlesnake. First thing I'll say is everybody asks, where are they, right? Where are they? I'm not gonna give away. I don't like to BS people, but I also don't give away the information, just to give it away. They are very sensitive. They're like, if you think about a species that congregates all in one area at certain times of the year, they're really easy to go and poach or kill. So if you know the spot and the spot gets out to the wrong person, it's documented that that's one of the reasons, or maybe the reason, that they're no longer abundant or even somewhat populous on the landscape. So I will show a couple maps, but I'm not. If you look at you just look at New Hampshire, they are south of the White Mountains. I'll give you that. They're not in the White Mountains. White Mountains are too high elevation. They never quite got there, but I have a map that shows that. But I just wanted to kind of preface that that it's this is being recorded, so it's also a very sensitive topic, and I'll give you as much information as I can, but there's some information that is just really sensitive, and we try not to get it into the. There are people out there that look for New Hampshire rattlesnakes because they're kind of a rare, genetically unique species. I'll start first with a couple slides on my program. So the non-game and endangered wildlife program, we are within the wildlife division at Fish and Game. We are 10 staff that manage over 400 species. Now, all those species are eligible to be managed. They're all non-game species. They're not hunted, fished, or trapped. But we, are only 10 staff. So we kind of have a subset of species that we work with, mostly the threatened and endangered species, the species that really are in need. But we do, I'll talk a little bit about the wildlife action plan. We put together, protocols and kind of strategies and concerns for all the other species, and hope that others, groups, organizations will pick up that task of managing them for us. So monitoring and research, habitat management, conservation planning. Each of these topics could be, a whole presentation in themselves, but each of our biologists kind of do all this with the species they're in charge with. And I'll always add the funding, because a lot of people think that, New Hampshire Fish and Game is all state funded. A lot of law enforcement is, and some programs are state funded, but here in the non-game program, we get only $100,000 a year in state general funds, and we have to match that with $100,000 in volunteer in donations. So we can't even get that money unless we raise $100,000. So most of our money is federal through state wildlife grants. You might have heard of Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That was in the news last year. It's been reintroduced, but that would increase state funding across the board, which would be really instrumental for our wildlife management and protections and land protection. But really it's conservation license plate, the moose plate, you might've seen that. I'm sure you have. That's about a quarter of our funding, but then half of it is federal grants. And the wildlife action plan, I won't go into this too much, but we have a revision coming up in 2015. It pretty much is New Hampshire's plan. It's not a fish and game plan. We coordinate the development of it, but we have so many partners that we use or that we utilize their expertise in developing this plan. So we've identified several, 169 species to pass around. That may go up now with new information coming in and species on the decline that we're realizing are declining. It probably won't go down too much. It probably will go up, but the habitats have stayed the same just because we don't get new habitats. Those are all every habitat type that we've identified in the state. Now, there's microhabitats of each of those, but those are the broad habitats. And these are just some of the partners that we've worked with to develop these plans over the last 20 years now. This is going to be, so we've had 2 plans. We have to do it every 10 years, and we need to do it to get funding for those federal grants. So these are just a few of the partners, the big ones, but certainly, even the public is engaged with, with outreach, with public information sessions to see kind of what people are interested in, what, ideas they have. So it's really a whole New Hampshire plan. And quickly, 51 threatened and endangered species. So the timber rattlesnake is one of those. 62 special concern species. Those are species that don't have a regulatory weight behind them, but they're kind of watch list species. And then all those combined with some other species make up those 169 special species of greatest conservation need. So really it's, like moose are on that, for example. They're not a threatened and endangered species, they're not special concern. But even though they're hunted and trapped, they are a species of greatest conservation need because they are really declining in the north with winter tick and with less snow over the winter. So there are several species that aren't even non-game species that are on our species of greatest conservation need list. So you can find that list on our website, as well as the threatened and endangered species list. And then lastly, before we talk about the rattlesnake in particular, these are just some of the active projects that us in the non-game program work with, some of the species that we work with. So, a lot of reptiles and amphibians, they're one of our more imperiled groups of species, but there are a few mammals as well, some invertebrates and birds. I'll say I didn't quite introduce myself, so maybe I should do that before I talk about the timber rattlesnake next. But I work with the timber rattlesnake, but I also work very closely with the piping plover population we have on Hampton and Seabrook Beach. And I've been doing that for the entire time that I've been doing the rattlesnake work. So I kind of have those 2 species. I do a couple other snakes as well, but those are my kind of 2 main focus areas, are the whole guild of snakes that we have, and then those shorebirds that are nesting on the beach. But I will help out with other projects as needed, but we have really our biologists kind of, with only 10 staff, we all have to we're spread thin. So we always are trying to, engage our partners, engage the public to help us identify, these rare species, help us in any way that they can. But it's really a big task for our program with that many species to manage. So the timber rattlesnake. This is a species that has a lot of misinformation. Generally, rattlesnakes in general over their range in North and South America. People see what they see on TV and they think that's what a rattlesnake is. And certainly any animal can be defensive, right? And be kind of striking at you. And that's sensational when you see it on TV. That's kind of promotes viewership, kind of the kind of like, oh my goodness, like, I can't believe that, snake almost got him. But really timber rattlesnakes are probably out of our 11 species that we have are probably the most docile species we have. I mean, we do handle them. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the radio telemetry we've done and some of the marking on individual snakes so that we can know if we identify the same snake over and over again. And obviously we use extreme caution and we have training and equipment, but I can't think of, I think of one time where I've had an animal strike, not near me, but close, like rear up like it was going to. They want to get away. They're trying to get away. And we're not approaching a snake that's cornered because it's going to really be defensive, but generally these snakes are just leave me alone. And they're really misunderstood. So people, they hear snake and then they hear venomous snake and it's like kind of DEFCON 5, but it's really not as, they're really not a dangerous, there are dangerous animals, but they're no more dangerous than I'd say like a hornet's nest for most people, or for like a moose that's in the rut that's charging you. There are a lot of dangerous animals out in the woods, but because they have venom doesn't mean that they're killing machines out there. A lot of snakes are misidentified as rattlesnakes. So we have the milk snake, which is most commonly misidentified. They're the snake on the left over here. They shake their tails very readily when they're nervous, and they almost try to mimic a rattlesnake, and that might be kind of a defense mechanism to show that, hey, I have a rattle, when it really doesn't, to scare someone away, especially young snakes. The younger the snake, typically the more feisty it is. So we'll get a lot of calls on, the 6-inch snake is striking at me, and it's a milk snake, but it's reared up. It thinks it's going to get eaten. So it's trying to scare whatever whatever's there away. The racer also shakes his tail very, very often when they're nervous. I've even seen garter snakes do it. They're a threatened species. They're large black snakes. So that it's the tail shaking, that, especially if it's in some dried leaves, it sounds like a rattle. Even if you don't see it, you see a shaking tail, that's a rattlesnake. The rattle on the right side is very, I'll have some better pictures of this probably, but it's very blunt. It's very obvious, to me at least. And maybe if the observer that's not too nervous, if they actually looked at the detail, they say, oh, that's the rattle, versus a long tapered tail. So I think first what I'll do quickly is go through some pictures of what our rattlesnakes look like. Then I'll talk a little bit about their natural history and kind of some conservation actions that we're doing in the history of them in New Hampshire. So these are kind of the two different color variations that we have. A lot of our snakes are very black, like this one. You can kind of see some orange, or not orange, brown banding on the back. And if they're in their shed cycle, sometimes they can look even more dull. But often they're hard to see the pattern. This one on the right, you can see the pattern very well and see the rattle very well. But generally, that's about as patterned a snake as we're going to get here in New Hampshire. Whereas in Massachusetts and Vermont, they have the yellow phase rattlesnake, which has a yellow head, and it's not bright yellow, but it's more of a yellow body with some banding over it compared to a black body with banding over it. So these are the two snakes that we have for what adults look like. These are all juvenile snakes. So young rattlesnakes will look a lot different than the adults. So this one on the left hasn't shed yet. It's probably only a couple days old. When they shed, they look more like this, where you can see the pattern come out, but before they shed, they're really kind of dull gray. And then these two on the right are, subadult snakes that might be 3 or 4 years old, but you can really see the pattern on them, where when they grow up, they may become adults that lose that really bright pattern and become almost darker. Some more examples of very dark snakes, and just kind of really they're, one of the points I wanted to make tonight is, where people wonder where rattlesnakes are, and they think just rock. And certainly rock is important. Rocky hillsides are important for rattlesnakes. That's kind of the classic, you find snakes in warm south-facing rocky hillsides, but really they're just a forest snake. They move huge distances. They move miles during the course of the year with our radio tracking that we've done. And they're just in the woods. And now they'll use microhabitats in the woods. They'll use like rock outcroppings. They'll use wetlands. They'll use just sunspots on the floor. They'll use some kind of denser, underbrush that if they're shedding their skin to kind of have a little more cover. But a lot of times, like on the left, we'll find a snake just coiled on the leaves. They're just, really my search image when I'm out looking for snakes is look for moose poop, because they just look like a pile of moose poop at first. A lot of times I see moose scat, it's a pile about the size of a rattlesnake, and I get like tricked out a little bit. Like, oh, that's a scat, because that's like my search image. So they're really, they're concealed sometimes, but they're really a very confident snake, and they don't need to be, undercover in fear of predators. They do have predators, but they're an apex predator, what we call, or top of the food chain. So, while a hawk or a bobcat could potentially take a rattlesnake, it's probably a rare occurrence, especially for a large adult. Younger ones more likely to be killed because, the hawk goes right for the head. Bobcats seem to know how to do it, go right for the head, and it's a good meal. So they're really, here's an example of one under a little bit of brush. You can see it has blue eyes. That's because it's going into shed. This one over here has a kind of a bluish eye. All snakes kind of get like a bluish tint when they go into shed. Their eyes turn blue because they have a scale over their eyes. And I'm not sure exactly why, like the pigment turns blue, but it's kind of signals that it's about to shed its skin, and it'll turn blue for a couple weeks, not fully blue, but just have a bluish tint. And then for a week or two, and then go back into its normal phase and then shed its skin. So they'll use cover a lot for that. Sometimes they'll use warm areas, like warm rock hillsides are great for shedding your skin, because that heat helps facilitate the shedding process. But again, here's just another picture, just a snake in the ground. just not really worried about anything, just, just hanging out. This is what they do when they're foraging, which is really interesting. Part of rattlesnake behavior is they're sit and wait predators. So most of or all of our other snakes will have to actively chase their prey or grab their prey before it leaves. Where rattlesnakes, what they do is they find the scent of a small mammal, like chipmunk or a mouse, and they sit and wait for that mouse to come run by, and they strike at it. And they don't grab it, they just inject their venom, let go, mouse runs off and dies, and the snake follows the trail to eat the food. If they held on, they risk breaking a fang if the mouse was, because they're not going to die on instant envenomation. So it's interesting. We've seen snakes when we've done radiotelemetry there for days in the same position, not moving at all, and just kind of stoic. And I think it's really kind of, I don't know. It just seems, I almost want to feed them a mouse or chipmunk that I find on the side of the road, one that's, not covered in, dirt or oil or anything, but you feel bad for them, like just waiting and waiting and waiting. The chipmunk might never come, but they do, grow. And so they certainly are well fed, and the area they are has a very high abundance of chipmunks and probably mice. You just don't see mice when you're out there because they're more secretive and probably nocturnal, but chipmunks are, every step is a chipmunk. So that might be one of the reasons why the place they are is good for them and why they're still there, is because it's a good prey base, in addition to the land protection and whatnot. Mating. Mating is kind of an interesting phenomenon for rattlesnakes too. They mate in the late summer or fall, and females will let off an airborne pheromone, and male rattlesnakes will pick that up and beeline for the female. So they somehow can pick up, and they can do this from over a mile away. We've seen, tracking a male rattlesnake one day. It's been making a movement over, in a kind of predictable direction, and then all of a sudden, a half mile the next time we're out there, he's in the opposite direction with a female. So somehow they release a pheromone that males pick up, and they move to find the female. And several males can mate with a female. They'll even do combat sometimes. And I've never seen it, been lucky enough to see that, but some researchers have, where the males will kind of, try to show each other up and just, there's no physical really confrontation, but it's more of like who can stand taller, who's the more fitter, who's the fittest animal here, the biggest, and one of the males will leave, and the other one is the winner of the female. And then the other male may mate with the female after the first male leaves. But they mate in the late summer and fall, and then the female actually doesn't give birth until the following fall. So the female retains the sperm over winter, and then she goes and fertilizes her eggs when she ovulates in the following spring. So it's a full year cycle for mating to birth, and it takes about 5 months to kind of gestate their young, depending on the temperature. But they'll give birth in the fall to a number of, I'll talk about, actually coming up in a few minutes, but they bask really all year. So females that become, we call gravid or pregnant in the following spring will bask and bask and bask all year. That's why these rocky hillsides are important. So I said they're forest snakes, but the rocky hillsides within the forest are very important for basking for gravid females. They really need that heat to help develop the young. Now, we've had situations where we've had poor weather years, and we've documented that, I should talk about this a little bit more, but that the development of the young takes longer. They're birthing later into the fall, and then those snakes may not, maybe at a higher risk for not making it back to the den or not finding food. Whereas if you have a nice hot summer, you can, birth maybe in August. This is similar to like what turtles do. Turtles, their hatch rate depends on how warm the nest site is. So the eggs might develop faster or will develop faster at a warmer site than a slower site. So really that heat helps them develop their young, and they'll spend the whole year at these sites. They won't eat any food. They'll just stay there. They will shed, but they'll forego food for the entire year. And then after they give birth, they'll go try to find food after that. But they lose a lot. They lose more than half their body weight oftentimes in those years. And these are a couple examples of what a gravid rattlesnake would look like. If you haven't seen several rattlesnakes, it might be hard to tell, but to me, this snake, you can see how kind of spread their scales are at the bottom here, even throughout here. So this is a large female that we actually documented giving birth to 19 live young. That's the most we've ever seen for one of our rattlesnakes. And you can see how big she is and how thick she is. Really, it's the size of the snake that dictates how many young they're going to have. They could have anywhere between 5 or 6 for a first-time reproducer to upwards of 19, where we've seen, which is way on the high end. The snake on the right, also, this is from this year. It's a little more slender than this one, but you can kind of tell this, the head and the neck are pretty thin. But then the kind of like from mid-body all the way to the tail, it stays thick instead of a taper, instead of a more slender taper. So really in the scales, you can kind of see our spread, you can see the white or the lighter color in between them because they're just spread apart because she's full of young. And they give birth to live young. One of our, about half our snakes give birth to live young, other half lay eggs. So they are give birth to live young. And actually, I think I'll talk a little bit. So that's just kind of the whole, if you think about it, they emerge in the spring from their winter dens, which are typically a single location that they all hibernate in. There might be a couple of those locations on the landscape, or there might be a single den where every snake in that population hibernates, which is why in the beginning, I told you that, I'm not going to give away the location of the site, because if you know where it is in the spring or the fall, they're all going to be there, coming out at the same time or over a several week period, going in over a several week period. You could easily, collect or kill a good portion of the population, or disturb if you just want to take photographs. But so they come out, they bask, they shed their skin, they forage throughout the year. They're moving miles over the course of the year. Males can move upwards of 5 miles. That's been documented in New York. Here in New Hampshire, we've seen them move 3 miles, straight line distance from where the den is. So they'll make like a big loop, and the farthest it will be away is 3 miles. So you can think about how big a forest block they need without having to cross a road or cross a development where they're potentially going to be killed. So they need a huge area. They mate in the fall, summer and fall, return back to their hibernacula in September and October. Hibernacula is another word for the den. And really it's only at most a 6-month active period, and then they're inactive for the next 6 months. So they're really one of our species that is, very limited on the landscape in terms of how long they're active during the course of the year. And that is directly relates to how kind of vulnerable the population is and how slow they grow and how long it takes to reproduce for the first time. Females, sometimes it takes 12, 13, 14 years before they can reproduce for the first time. It's like turtles in a way. Some of these animals are long-lived and it takes a long time to get to maturity. But whereas turtles can then reproduce every year once they get mature, rattlesnakes in the northern areas where we are, with such a short growing season, they give birth, they need several years to recover. A female that loses half her body weight is going to need multiple years to recover. It only has a short window to do it, 6 months each year. So 3 or 4 years could be the interval between a snake. So a gravid rattlesnake or a female rattlesnake might only give birth 3 or 4 times in her lifetime for an average lived rattlesnake, which is maybe probably somewhere in the 20s years old. They can live up to 45. It's been documented, at least in New York in the wild, but that's very rare. Probably the average is somewhere in the 20s, I would say. But we've seen snakes that just looked old and look like that's like a 30-year-old rattlesnake right there. Just kind of gnarly, and they're big, and they really, because they don't have those predators or many predators, they can live a long time. But you lose a couple of those females, in a population, a small population, then you lose a lot of your reproductive power because their reproductive interval is so great, and because they can't reproduce until they're a certain size, that even those young snakes that were born the previous year, they got to wait 10 years before they can even contribute to the population. And that they have to survive those 10 years. As young snakes, there's a lot of predators, even turkeys, crows, even chipmunks. Now it's probably more prey on a dead rattlesnake, but they could, a lot of things can kill a young rattlesnake. They're really pretty tiny. So that's kind of their general life history. And now I'll talk about kind of their historic range in New Hampshire, as well as kind of their range across the United States. There are upwards of 30 plus rattlesnake species that are known. This is just the range of the timber rattlesnake. So you can see up here in New Hampshire, we have this kind of, just a little dot right there. There's a couple dots over here. There's a couple dots in Vermont and New York, northern New York. But then everything else is they're pretty much a southern snake. The core of their range is, the Appalachian Mountains. and then down further south. There, you know, in comparison to New Hampshire and northern New England, their growing season's much longer. They only have to hibernate a short period of time. They can reproduce much faster. So they just don't have that kind of limiting factor that they have in New England, as well as New England was settled much earlier in our history than these parts of the country. So colonial settlers, as they came over, encountered the rattlesnake. They'd never seen a rattlesnake before, or certainly there were probably several deaths from rattlesnakes or major injuries, and they made it a point to kill all those, like they killed, like people, you know, in civilizations, in colonial sites, killed wolves, killed mountain lions. So they're just a predator that's a danger, and they were killed off over the hundreds of years that colonial settlers were here. So during the beginning of that settlement that I just spoke of, this is probably the range of rattlesnakes in New Hampshire, what's best known based on historic literature, rattlesnake named sites. Still northern New England, this is the very edge of their range that they ever migrated up to over after the glaciers receded, because it just gets too cold as you get farther north. And there's just not enough time window to survive as far as a long growing season, and there's just fewer and fewer places in harsher climates. So on the left is probably maybe you could say the 16 or 1700s, or our best kind of estimate based on what we know based on historic literature. And then on the right, this is probably this is the 70s through the 90s. And this is in print and in paper, so this is not information that I have to worry about sharing, but it does show general locations of where our snakes are remaining, right? So there's a couple spots. You can, if the kind of intuitive person could look at a map and kind of surmise that they might be here, based on knowing that they're what they need for a range and what they need for habitat and what's developed and what's not. So it's not a secret where they are. People do know, and people around the area do know, but it's just not something that we want to advertise to get out to the wrong hands, because we do monitor the site very closely with law enforcement, with cameras. They're very vulnerable. We want to make sure that they remain here. Same thing with some of our rare turtle hibernate, like wood turtles, where they hibernate. They tend to hibernate all in one area in streams and rivers, and they're very lucrative. It's a very lucrative business to collect wood turtles and sell them on the black market. You can get, upwards of, almost $1,000 for some turtles, individual turtles. Now for rattlesnakes, it could be similar, especially if it's a New Hampshire rattlesnake, a genetically unique one that looks a little different than others, that might be very valuable to a collector, and why we are very careful with the site and the location. So the site that we know of wasn't discovered until 1991. Now, they were always there, but it just wasn't known that was a remaining population. We thought that they were extinct. And when they were officially listed in 1987, it was like, well, they're state endangered, but they're gone. So we'll list them anyways. I don't know why it was when they thought they were extinct to list them, but they did. And it was only a couple of years later that a forester found or encountered a rattlesnake and described it accurately to a biologist at Fish and Game. And kind of reconnaissance was done, and then the population was discovered. So for those first couple of years, it was a lot of research and just trying to identify how big the population is, how far it moves. It was done actually by not by Fish and Game, but by some amateur. I say amateur, but herpetologists. One fellow name was Andy Soha, and the others was Jim Taylor, and he's a professor at UNH. And they were the first ones to really document the rattlesnake population size out there and kind of the critical habitats that they used. And they put together reports for Fish and Game and whatnot. And after it was documented, it was like, okay, now what do we do? It was kind of left alone, and just law enforcement would occasionally go out there and just check on, just the basking areas in the den, make sure that people weren't out there, make sure that, there wasn't really the scrutiny for protection then, I don't think, as there is now, because it was still unknown if there were others in the state. So it was kind of like a personal interest of some of our law enforcement officers that went out there just to kind of keep a presence out there. But then in 2006, the first wildlife action plan that we got in 2005, one of the immediate actions we had was to determine the status of our timber rattlesnake population. The only one we know that we have left was identified in the early 90s. There's been no research on it since. We don't even know how many snakes are out there. we know it's been isolated for decades. So there's probably not good. There's probably going to be some problems there, as you know, or as you may know, that, populations that are isolated can be prone to genetic inbreeding. So there are several documented species case studies where inbreeding has caused population declines and caused eventual extinction of some populations because their fitness is altered and sometimes they get deformities. As that's done generation after generation, that might have been happening with our rattlesnake population. So we didn't know. So 2006 came along. I had worked for the Department for Piping Plovers in 2005. I just graduated from UNH. And in 2006, I was able to land the job with my then boss, Mike Marchand, who's now our program coordinator, to go out and try to identify how many snakes we have in this population, what areas they're using, what areas need to be protected, kind of really almost like a baseline starting from zero, because all we had was what we know from the early 90s, and then a couple key spots that law enforcement would tell us they saw several snakes. So we were going really from scratch. So 2006, fast forward to now, is what we know. But the first year we were out there, we actually documented, and we didn't really even know what we were looking at, but you might have heard of snake fungal disease. And that's something that popped up in New Hampshire and kind of Illinois at the same time. It was documented really in, I think it was the same time about both states, but we were really one of the first ones to kind of say that there's something wrong. And we were asking other researchers. We didn't have experience with rattlesnakes particularly. So we didn't know that all these snakes that we were seeing, like this one on the left with its face all crusty and gnarly, and this one on the right with all these lesions on it, they were basking for like the entire summer. And we were just like, well, okay, we're seeing snakes, we're seeing they're alive, they're surviving, but we don't know really what's going on. Other researchers have said they're hibernation blisters. That sometimes happens with being, if you're in a wet environment in hibernation. But really, it was later found out to be a novel fungus that is affecting the population, one that had never been identified, called Ophidiomyces ocolia. And it's similar, it's not on the level of white nose syndrome for bats, like it hasn't caused population range-wide crashes like that, but it almost took out our New Hampshire population. This is the number of snakes we found, and this each year has standard consistent monitoring efforts, so consistent time we're out there. So the first year we marked 30 individual snakes, and we would mark them on the tail with paint on the rattle. So we'd be able to identify them again if we saw them. So it's been something that's been used as paint marking on the rattle, which it's not the greatest, but we didn't have really experience handling snakes at that point. So we do it with kind of a long telescoping pole and just put a little nub of paint on there, or maybe mixed colors. So we know the same snake. We weren't counting, there were really only 10 snakes and we counted 30. But we did mark 30, but then look at the following years with the same effort, so few snakes that we marked. And then in 2011, we saw a total of 5 snakes total out of that entire summer with the same effort. So this is, indicative of the fungus that we saw that was later identified of snakes dying, and that, some go into hibernation, never come out. Some go in basking areas, might go down under rocks and never come out. A lot of them got picked off by predators. We saw bodies scavenged by vultures. They were just dying all over the place. And still, we don't know exactly where this fungus came from. It might have been always present in the environment, but something has made it flare up, and now it's been seen across the United States. Really, I think it's maybe even west of the Mississippi River now, and actually in probably 30 plus species. So it's showing up. It's not having the level of impact on other species per se as it was rattlesnakes. We think that the combination of the genetic inbreeding, so low genetic diversity, this fungus. And then we put out a paper on this, but also if you remember the Mother's Day floods, right? Those years where we had 2 weeks of rain and the whole state was underwater. Well, that was coinciding with this disease and with a genetically inbred population, and all those things together, we surmise is one of the reasons that the population declined by over 50%, maybe even more. So I have a paper, or we put a paper out with a lead researcher that had worked on rattlesnakes in other populations, and he compared the genetic diversity of several other populations in different areas of New York, just like how many different genetic alleles and different markers there could be in those populations compared to what was in New Hampshire. And New Hampshire was much lower. see on the right. If you don't understand genetics, it's a little tricky, but we explain it in the paper a little bit. And if anybody's interested in this paper, I have my business card in the back of the table. Email me. It's not available online. It's one of those ones that you have to pay for or know the author to get the paper because of the journal doesn't allow it. But as a author of it, I can send out the paper to people that are interested. So if you're interested in reading this, it's a very interesting paper. We have another one that we put out that's online on our website that's also interesting, but not to the level of this one. This one's just kind of like it's been cited by a lot of authors. Just the kind of like a case study paper almost, and it's interesting with the rainfall that we've had and in those years. Those were 100-year events. That, as you can see on the map below, 2006 followed by 2007, the 2 wettest years on record in the past 100 years span we did from 2009 to 1909. That's based on weather data. I'm not sure what the source of that was, but National Weather Service, something like that. So just an interesting phenomenon where if you have a small isolated population, not only are they vulnerable to, people going out there and potentially collecting and killing them, but, certain events that happened they could potentially be gone in an instant, almost within a couple of years. So that shows the vulnerability of New Hampshire's rattlesnakes. However, 2011, so that 2011 was the year we had only 5 snakes. 4 of them were gravid females. Now, I'm sure there are other snakes out there that we didn't see. There wasn't just one male, or there could have been, but there are other snakes out there. But we really got really lucky because we had more than 40 young born that year that we documented. Previous years, so this was kind of leading up to that with the snake fungal disease and with the rain. We had snakes that we had brought into captivity to try and captive birth so that we could ensure all the snakes survive. And several of them didn't even produce live snakes. They just were undeveloped ova because that, what I talked about before, the gestating and the need to bask, they had all that rainfall. They had all those cloudy days. And the genetic inbreeding could play a part in it. Maybe they're, just not going to have viable offspring anymore. It's been documented in, some like Florida panther, for example. I think several animals were sterile, born sterile, because just that inbreeding over time, it does a lot of funky things. So we had several snakes that gave birth, but to what we call slugs or just undeveloped ova. Snakes never developed. But then 2011 happened and we were like, wow. And we were, blown away almost, kind of in disbelief. Still though, not out of the woods, right? So we have all these young snakes, but how are we there's still stuff I'll talk about at the end that how are we gonna recover this population? But then the same thing happened in 2014 with actually the same 4 individuals. They were all on a 3-year cycle, and those exact same 4 individuals that we documented birthing in 2011 were birthed in 2014 because we knew they were the same ones because they were marked. And they also had a high number of live youngs. Now we have a lot of young snakes out in the landscape. So what do we do? Well, that's still a question that we'll talk about. But in the meantime, in the interim, we're starting to have more snakes on the landscape. All right, we got to make sure this land is protected. We got to make sure these threats are addressed. So we really focused a lot on land protection. I don't have a slide specifically for land protection, but I will say that since 2006 and really between 2010 and 20, we protected more than upwards of 1,000 acres of their habitat where they are. Now it's adjacent to other conservation land, so it's really kind of filling in a block in a nice, so it's protected in perpetuity now, which is great. So now we did that part. Now we got to worry about what we're going to do with the actual snakes to make sure they don't succumb to disease again, if they don't weak out. So what we focus a lot on is outreach, is kind of threats that they have when they kind of occasionally will run into a development that's been encroaching or have to cross a road. So that's been a lot of our work. I will talk about the real need here, and the obvious one that I kind of haven't said is genetic augmentation. With all these inbred snakes, we need, and it's in our wildlife action plan, that's one of the main strategies, is to augment the genetic diversity so that you don't have these inbred snakes giving birth to, undeveloped ova. And so they're more robust overall, the population, to some kind of emerging threat that happens, like a disease that could take out the whole population. If they're all identical or close to identical animals, they're all going to succumb to the same thing. If you have a diversity of animals, they're more robust in terms of surviving that kind of thing. So I'll talk a little bit about the end, but this is the last, up till 2022, we've had good reproduction these last 4 years. So we have a lot of young snakes out there now, and these snakes that were in 2011 and 14 are now coming into their breeding years. So they're giving birth. They may be some of these, they actually are, a couple of them are these individuals that we've documented that were born here, or maybe probably 2011, I think, because 14 would still be too early for that, but 11, so that'd be their first breeding year. So that's great. We still have the inbreeding problem, but we have animals to work with now. And this is just a quick example of kind of a neat little thing that rattlesnakes give parental care to their young. They're the only snake in New Hampshire that we know that does that. And care is more of just being a presence there when the snakes are born and for the first couple weeks of life. They don't, bring them food or anything like that, but they're just a presence kind of guarding their young in a way. You can see the snake coiled up in the left here with the mother. And then this is just kind of an example of one of the, you can see a little nub here. And actually the next slide, I think, well, this is, sometimes we'll see just a pile of little snakes that they'll all be birthed in one area near the den. Usually snakes, the adults will come back to the den, give birth there. So the snakes the young ones don't have to travel far to get back there, and they can hibernate there. They do have to find food, which is going to be tough, but they do have parental care. This is another snake that has a little neonate, which we call them neonates when they're first born, with her. And this is kind of up close what they look like. So this is an animal on the left that hasn't shed yet. So they'll take about 10 days before they shed their first skin. That's their kind of their neonatal skin, and they'll have like a pre-button, what we call it, for the rattle. And then once they shed, it will kind of almost like be the rattle now. It'll have like a little button with a little segment on it. It still won't really make any noise. If they shake their tail, it might make a tiny noise. But on the right is a snake that has already shed, so it's probably a couple weeks old, maybe 3 weeks old from that year, but it was born that year. So that's the difference in they shedding that skin, what they look like, the pattern underneath. So it's pretty interesting. So part of also what we wanted to do and what the land protection part of our conversation, we had to learn how these snakes moved. So we had to identify on the landscape what areas to protect. We knew generally where the main den and basking area was, but we had to identify other areas and how far they moved and kind of, priority areas for targeted, outreach or straight out land protection. So we've followed several snakes around, probably, I'd say upwards of 50 individuals. Well, maybe not 50, probably 30 individuals that we've followed with transmitters to get an idea of the entire use of the site. And it also will inform forest management. So that there's different landowners out, even though the lands are protected, there's different landowners and they have different forest management plans. We work with them to do that. So the land's not going to be developed, but they may want to do forestry cuts on their land, which is actually good for rattlesnakes. But there's also a potential danger of, snake getting run over, or if it's done in the wrong place at the wrong time of year. So a lot of these questions we had that we needed answers to. So we followed snakes around. We put the transmitters in the body, which is the procedure by a veterinarian. So we collect the snakes, bring them to a veterinarian that we worked with, and we would anesthetize the snakes. So essentially get them in like a chamber, a box, actually that the vet used to use for cats, like really bad cats that were crazy and they just needed to get them anesthetized. They'd get them in this holding tank that had tubes going in the top of it to send the isoflurane in and kind of knock it out so they could at least work with it and get, then get a mask on it. So we did this with the snakes because obviously we're not going to just grab a snake by the head and put a mask over it with the risk of being bitten. So we want to knock them out. We take them out, then we put the mask over the head and kind of gets the direct gas right in the mouth. And that's what they use for other animals for, for any dental work, or it's the same type of gas. This is one of our doctors or really our only vet that has done the work. So can't really see it, but here we're putting a transmitter in the body. So really you're cutting between the scale. It seems like a risky process, and it does come with some risk. And certainly with an endangered species, we don't want to kill any snakes. Looking at my time here. So we actually have only lost 2 snakes over the probably 50 plus surgeries, because some of the snakes have had to have new transmitters put in, so they've been in through multiple surgeries. And the reason for those losses was because they had prior or something else going on, and we determined that they had an infection, that's what's the final straw, was the final flow. But really, it's a safe process. It's been done worldwide now since the 80s, but still is a risk in surgery. We don't want to put our snakes through surgery all the time, right? So we've actually developed, and not developed, but we've worked with Massachusetts herpetologists and kind of, I'm sure people have done this before, but we hadn't really seen it in the literature, but attaching rattles or transmitters to the rattles. So the rattles are very fragile, but if we can get a small enough transmitter and tape it on the base of it, there's no risk to the snake. I mean, it has kind of, it's kind of ego hurt, right? Because it has this transmitter on its rattle and everybody can see it, but you know, the snake doesn't even have to be brought into the office or into the vet. It just can be done in the field. We can get them in a restraining tube where their head and body are in there, and it's a two-person job. So one person holds the snake in the tube, and the other puts on the transmitter. And we do it with tegular and medical tape, which is tape that you might use for like a burn victim or something where you have really sensitive skin. We wrap that around a couple times, and it's held on the transmitters very well. We have had a couple rattles break, so it's not foolproof, but it does significantly reduce, or it eliminates the risk of surgery. And it still have been an effective method for us. So this is a snake on the left that has a transmitter on the rattle. You can't really see it. This is kind of a cool picture of how it went on a log after it released it. This is my colleague, Melissa Winters, and she's holding one of our snakes. So you can see there's a restraining tube here. It's pretty much a clear plastic tube, and they come in different sizes based on what you need for the size of the snake. And really you have to just, there's risk involved, but we wear gaiters or high boots that are snake protection boots, and you have to manipulate the snake in a way that it goes into the tube, and then when it's in far enough, you grab it and kind of force it in a little more so it can't pull out. So really the risk is like if it's not in far enough and it pulls out when you go to reach, we have to just make sure it's in far enough. So, but then it's safe for the snake, right? Because it's not going to hurt itself by writhing around. I mean, it might writhe around it's pretty well contained once it's halfway in there. It can still move its lower part of the body, but it seems to be, you know, they're calmer than you would expect. They're not doing an alligator roll, like, but they're kind of just, they know they're immobilized, and it's safe for us, of course. All right, and I think I only have a couple more slides, so, or I might have to scroll through these a little quicker because it's already 7:54 and I could talk for hours about this, but I only have an hour. From radio telemetry, we learned how late they emerge from the hibernacula, from the den. So that's where we get the 6-month window. They sometimes, you know, May 31st, the snake's not coming out till May 3rd. This warm weather that we're having, there might be a few snakes that poke out their heads, but the majority of the population isn't going to be out until May. If they're so far in there, so far in the rock crevices they are, that in rattlesnakes den in rock crevices deep in the hillside, and they're 20 to 30 feet into the hillside. It takes, you know, weeks of that warmth to get warm enough in there, whereas other snakes that hibernate in chipmunk burrows or, you know, in shallower places can come out and are certainly out now. There's certainly snakes out this week. So rattlesnakes are we found that they're very late emergers, and they also go in earlier than we thought. They're going in as soon as they get back to the hibernation, the den. September, they're going in. They're not wasting any time staying out, basking, even if it's warm. They're just like, they're programmed to just go right in. Whereas some other snakes you might see out taking advantage of the late season sun. The forest snake I mentioned with the rocky outcroppings in the basking areas, wetlands, and they move miles over the course of the year. Gravid females do not move miles. They tend to stay in those rocky areas that are close to the den and just bask and bask and bask until they go back to the den and give birth. And I think I'll skip over this a little bit quickly. So this is what we've done. We put out a paper on this recently, but we've done some habitat management out at the site. So now that the land is protected and we have management plans that we've developed for the land, we identified a need that, you know, there's not a lot of, in a lot of our state, right, there's not a lot of disturbance to forests. There's forests that grow, there's no fire anymore. You know, we haven't had a big hurricane in a long time that's knocked down, you know, a quarter of the trees. So really these rocky areas that these snakes rely on have all become, or a lot of them have become really shaded over. And so less sunlight's hitting the rocks. In that gestation that they need is fueled by kind of heat. So the more heat they can get, the faster they can give birth, the sooner the snakes can get back to the den, eat find a meal, and be in hibernation. So we wanted to kind of speed that up by creating more habitat for them. So we've done over the years, we've managed probably 10 to 15 different rocky outcrops with hand cutting in the inactive season. So after snakes have gone in hibernation, we go out there with chainsaws with a couple of our team, and we leave all the trees down as they fall. We might move a couple off specific rocks if they're on like good basking rocks, but it's also going to attract prey to those areas where all the trees that are falling down, it's kind of a big kind of mess. That would be great for chipmunks and for small mammals. We did some monitoring. This is kind of what it looks like, the same site. This is the same site both years, or 2 different years. This is, I think, 2014, and then this is 2015. So there's that pine right here. Is this pine right here? This rock is this rock. So it's the same site. It's just now it's open to the canopy's open. Really, we wanted to document if snakes were using those areas. Now this was going to be tricky because we don't have every snake monitored with telemetry, but we use cameras, game cameras on time lapse featured because they're not going to pick up a snake that's moving. And we tried to identify if snakes were using the area more than they were previous to it, because we monitored with cameras prior to the cutting as well. Here's an example of camera facing one of the sites. And we did see snakes. Now we saw only a couple. It was probably statistically not very powerful because I think we saw 5 days. We saw snakes right here. Yeah, five days versus 0 days pre-cut. So only 5 snakes versus 0. That's over 2 years monitoring versus 1. So it's still not a lot, but it does document that snakes do respond to these areas and use these spots. Now, you need a larger sample size to have statistics with that, but it was interesting to document that. We also documented prey increasing from especially chipmunks. So once those trees were down, there was more foraging opportunities for chipmunks than there were previously because there's more cover. Also predators increased, but not as much as we thought. So they increased, like bobcats, for example, or coyotes, we catch on the cameras. They increased a little bit, but not as much as we thought, which is good because we didn't want to bring in predators to basking sites. Hawks were one of them as well, on perching on trees. Moose and deer loved it because of all the sprouts that were popping up. So that's some of the habitat management that we've done. So we protected the land. Well, we've done the monitoring to identify the status of the population. We protected the land. We've done some habitat management. Now this is the outreach portion of, and this is I'm only going to talk a little bit about the outreach we've done because we need to do more targeted outreach with landowners that are right around the site. And we've started to do that, but these are kind of popular articles that we put out for the public. I didn't bring copies of these because they don't have enough, but this is available on our website. It's an article that we put out pretty much talking about what I'm talking about today in our wildlife journal. It's available online on our website. This is the snake that's at you can't see the snake really, you can't see him in there, but you can kind of see him there. He's a venomoid rattlesnake that's had its venom glands removed when it was younger. It's not from New Hampshire. I don't know who did that. It wasn't done in New Hampshire, but we have been allowed to use the snake as an outreach animal for people to visit the Audubon Center at the Massapequa Audubon Center, which is in Auburn, New Hampshire, right outside of Manchester. So that's just an example of a rattlesnake, although it looks different than our rattlesnakes. Doesn't look like a native snake, but it still, educates people on what they look like up close. And these last couple slides are kind of what I wanted to finish up on. Looks like we have for time. It's 8 o'clock now, so this will take me a couple minutes, and then we can open up for questions as long as people want to stay. I'm happy to talk. So, population number. This is what people often ask me. And earlier on in the monitoring we've done back in the late 2000s, and then from maybe up to 2015, we had a good handle on that. But now that we have had so many youngborn, we don't know the survivorship of all those because we haven't been able to track those as well. It's hard to mark, or we don't mark the young neonates. You could we use pit tags or like microchips, what we use, like people put in their dogs and cats for larger snakes, pretty much really anything, it could just not, it's a young newborn rattlesnake is too small for that. We have to put it under the skin. It might injure it or kill it. So that's the question we have, is how many of these young snakes are surviving? We don't know. We have seen several though, the following years, several young of the year snakes there. We just don't have a good handle on how many there are. So that's where the population number is we're not sure. I'd say it's between 50 and 100. 100 on the high end. And that's just my gut feeling that it's up, it could be upwards of that, but a lot of those are young snakes that aren't in the reproductive class yet. Where if we have 50 individuals that might be reproductively active or close to 50, then there's that young cohort. So we've done all the things I've talked about, but the last really kind of key thing, or for our next steps, really is this bottom one I'm going to talk a little bit about. But you know, we want to continue monitoring the population. We're not monitoring it as intensively as we used to. We don't need to research these snakes just to research them. You know, we've identified the habitats they use, how many are in the population. You know, they're an endangered species. We don't want to just unnecessarily harass them. So we check up on them. We try to get a handle on if there's any thing going on at the site, if there's any disease concerns. We want to get a number of how many animals are reproducing each year if we can. We still do a little bit of telemetry in kind of areas where we know we find a snake in an area that we don't have a lot of data on, and they typically are very habitual movers. So they'll go in one area every year, the same area, even the same rocks miles away. They'll inhabit that, they'll be near that rock at the same time, like almost at sometimes the exact same date, year after year. They just know where they're going. And really wildlife, people often don't understand how programmed they are to know their habitats and exactly where they're going. So when you move an animal, it's like taking one of us and throwing us in the Adirondacks and saying, good luck. It's really, they're just confused and trying to find their way back. So they go to these same areas, and some of these areas have been a little closer to developments that have encroached a little bit. So we've tried to get a more handle on that. So that's where we're doing the telemetry. Habitat management is as needed, but we've done a lot of that's been in land protection. Most of it is protected. There's a couple parcels still that we are interested in, but you know, it's an interesting market now with, you know, with the cost of everything. So getting kind of funding and kind of additional funding for Recovering America's Wildlife Act, if we could get that would increase our funding upwards of $11 million annually, which sounds like a lot, but we're a minimum state. So it's really a $1.3 billion bill that is taken from the general fund, the treasury, but it's just, there has to be the stumbling block was how are they going to pay for it, and how is Congress going to determine how we pay for it? And there's kind of a couple ideas of, I'm kind of getting into this, but this is why it failed, is because we couldn't, you know, oil and gas leases on federal lands, that was thought of, but then conservation organizations were like, well, we don't want to, you know, be connected to, you know, carbon emissions. And then there was cryptocurrency was a thought, but that was kind of, didn't have enough weight to it. So we're trying to figure out how to do that, but that would allow us to protect the rest of this land. Really, that would be a huge amount of money. Right now, we have about $500,000 annually to spend on all of our projects, all of our staff, all of our contracts with Audubon, with TNC, with state parks, things like that. So continued outreach. We're continuing to work with landowners around the site. But this last one is the one that I'm ending with, and it's the one I want to say a lot about, and I want to, you know, it would be really easy to do in a sense, but we're a public agency where we want to be responsible. We want to, you know, engage the public, and there's been history of, you know, augmentations that have worked for other species, but with rattlesnakes, it's just a little more tricky, just because they're a venomous species and the perception they have, and, you know, increasing a population, you know, moving animals from another population into a population is risky because, like I said before, animals move, especially when they've been moved, and they might disperse into, you know, far into neighborhoods, into, you know, and there's always a risk, and it's something if we want to assume that risk or not. And our department has been, you know, very proactive in our management, but I think we've been unsure about kind of what level we want to attempt an augmentation, but it's absolutely needed because in 50 years, this population is not going to be doing well. It might be gone if there's not new genes in there to keep it healthy. So the question is, how do we do it? We do have partners in other states with rattlesnake in their rattlesnake populations. We could use those snakes to augment our population. We could do captive breeding. We could move gravid females from one site to another. We could just release young snakes from a neighboring state into the den, and that would be your genetics right there, right? Or part of them, but they're not going to then reproduce for 10 years. So it's going to be a long time to get the genetic diversity up anyways, but we need to start. We're just losing time. the longer we go. So it's something that I think we're going to approach in the coming years. But Massachusetts, you might have heard of, has had a the Quabbin Reservoir. They wanted to repopulate that or establish a population out there. It's a big land mass that they have that's undeveloped and that's protected, but the public shot it down because it's a rattlesnake. So it's kind of one of those things that you have to be careful. The wrong political party or person that has something against whatever can shoot it down. So it's something that we could do quietly and not tell anybody, but we want to be responsible, and we also want to be able to report on it. So if we did it privately and kind of just under the table, which we certainly are within our rights to do as a department, they're a wild animal. We're managing this. We would follow the animals with telemetry, kind of do our due diligence to make sure they remain there. But it's a dicey situation, I suppose. And we want to be able to report how well it works. And if we did it in secret, and then we wouldn't be able to report how it worked. And that's an important thing. But one way or another, we're going to have to do it in the next at least 5 to 10 years. It's going to have to be, something's going to be done so we can get this population back to where it needs to be. The area can probably support, there are a couple different den sites out there. It can support potentially 200 animals. With continued encroachment of development, there's always, right now in this time of our, in our history is a very, it's a lot of money coming in for development from federal government. It's a lot of pressure we have that we review a lot of developments that in some are around the rattlesnake site. And, there's only so much you can do to really prevent these unless the land is protected. So, with 200 snakes, there might be, some situations, but people in the Southwest and the South live with snakes every day. There's rattlesnakes and other venomous species all across the southern part of the country, and people coexist. And there are bites, but there are, I think some of the last numbers I saw, there are upwards of 10,000 envenomations a year in the United States, but fewer than 10 or 15 people succumb to those. That's because we have such good access to antivenom, compared to some of the other third world countries maybe that don't. And that some of those snakes are even more toxic than ours, but people that succumb tend to have an allergic reaction, like if you would have like a bee sting. If you're allergic to a bee sting, they kind of go into anaphylactic shock. And that's not to say there's no risk, but it's not as big of a risk as people think, but nobody wants to be bitten. So we want to do our due diligence and make sure the public is supportive of kind of what we're doing. So with that, I think I've run over a little bit, but I'm happy to stay as long as people want to ask questions, and yeah, go from there. Yes, I didn't mention that, but they have infrared, they have heat sensing pits in there, so below their eyes, and it's not their nostrils, but it's kind of aside from those, and they can see, if you picture, nobody knows exactly how a snake sees infrared, but picture like the movie The Predator. That's theoretically what he could see. It sees so when you're waiting for a mouse, you see a flash of heat go across, that's one of your triggers to go. Certainly if they see it as well, but the heat is one of the ways they detect their prey. And then certainly once the mouse dies and runs off, they can search for that heat signature, and that's where they can, and the scent, and find the mouse.
Thank you so much. I had a couple of questions come in through the folks watching online. And one of them was talking about a personal experience where they saw out in Idaho a large rattlesnake run over by a pickup truck. They said after a short pause, the snake slithered off the road into the desert. And the question was, could it survive? Could it survive something like that, or is that more sort of a last?
Yeah, it depends on if it was run over just on the end of the tail, it could survive probably, but generally we don't have, we have a lot of wildlife rehabbers. There's not a lot of snakes that are rehabs from road kills or road strikes. They just, they don't have any protection. Like a turtle shell can buffer some of it and be cracked, but a snake, once it's run over, unless it's on the very posterior part of the body, it's very unlikely to, I'm not saying it's impossible, but very unlikely to survive. So it might have survived the impact, but then eventually it would have internal hemorrhaging and die, I would presume.
So along those same lines, another question, because you talked about with radio tagging and the use of tagging their rattles and the being fragile. What happens if a rattlesnake rattle breaks? Are they able to regenerate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I should have met, that's kind of rattlesnake 101 that I should have mentioned. But so every time a rattlesnake sheds its skin, so it's born with the little nub called the pre-button, and it then turns in, when it sheds its skin for the first time, it gets that one little segment, and that makes the button. And then, excuse me, every time it sheds, it gets another segment. So it's really, the rattles are it's keratin material like fingernail. So so the longer the snake lives and sheds, it's going to get more and more rattles. Now they're fragile, so they break off after a certain length, and they're, so we don't see many rattlesnakes with more than 15 segments. That would be a lot for a rattlesnake. Sometimes you'll see one with 20 and be like, wow, it's been really a lucky snake. It hasn't got caught on anything. But a lot of times it's, somewhere between, 10 or under. So they get in, and they're just very loosely connected. So you shake them, it sounds like a bottle of Advil shaking. And I didn't have a rattle to bring, but it's very interesting how they have those. But it's just fingernail material. It's hollow. It's very fragile.
Okay, one more question that I had that came in. That is, so there are in New Hampshire a number of landmarks that have rattlesnake in the name. So they're like, there's Rattlesnake Mountain. Think is there's Rattlesnake Island.
Yep.
Are there, some of the historic data, are these areas that have had historic populations, or is it, like anything, just sort of a name that,
Yep.
that got tagged on there?
It's probably a mix, but I would think a lot of them have the appropriate looking habitat that they might have at one time, had a rattlesnake population. Rattlesnake Island is a little different. I think that was more of a myth, or rattlesnakes were brought to the island by people, so then they called it Rattlesnake Island. But to actually exist in natural habitat, a lot of those features look like they probably could have had rattlesnakes, and maybe when the first settlers got here, they did. But certainly some of them also could have been misnamed for, people that named things way back when might have, milk snakes were named milk snakes because people thought they milked the cows because they were always found in the barns. And they're also referred to as adders, but milk snake, they must be milking the cows. And then that stuck back from those colonial days. So that could be an example of why, there's snakes on that hill. It must be rattlesnakes, and that's a rattlesnake hill. So it could be it's probably a mix of both. You had another question?
I was thinking earlier before you kind of explained it, how you can get in, adult individuals from other populations, say New York or Massachusetts, and introduce and then exchange them to New York. But your primary concern is they're going to wander out of the area to where they won't be able to breathe when they contact.
It's not as it's a potential concern. It's something that we would certainly be able to. It's more the perception of what people would think. It's not. I think it's very likely that we could introduce a couple male rattlesnakes, for example, and that they would find females easily. And we put radio transmitters on them, and we'd monitor them very closely. So if they looked like they were moving away, that we would collect them, move them back, and do that over and over again until they and if they kept doing it, then all right, maybe the snake just isn't going to take. But over time, I think it's been done in other sites where snakes do eventually take to the habitat because there's a lot of scent trails around. So I want to say it's easily done. It's just getting the kind of commitment to do it, and we haven't really had like a public campaign or really talked a lot about it. It's kind of been something that's been like, oh, we need to do that, but we don't know if we're going to get any support for it. So maybe this is the time to really start that kind of campaign of we need to do that.
But if you're exchanging a population, you're reducing the anything.
Well, we wouldn't be providing rattlesnakes to it. It wouldn't be like a trade. So there are other populations in the Northeast that are robust. There are some like in the Berkshires of Massachusetts. In New York, there are several populations that are very robust. Vermont is it's definitely stronger than ours. They only have 2 populations. So we would really have I don't know what we would exchange for or how we would do it, but we would just kind of take those in good faith, and they would be, supporting us in our conservation by providing genetics for us. So they'd be losing snakes. We'd only be gaining. We have so few animals, we're probably not going to be, and they're already kind of genetically, maybe less fit, and maybe other sites don't want to introduce these genetics into their site. So we just want to kind of build up our genetic diversity. So it wouldn't be a loss of snakes. It'd be just kind of augmenting, and it would probably only take, I don't have to look at the literature. I'm not a geneticist, but 5 or 10 males, and then breeding, or maybe a couple times over a couple decades, getting new individuals in there, that would probably really increase over time, just the genetic diversity of the population. Now, I'd have to look more into it and talk with a geneticist, but it has been done with it's been reported on with other populations in Europe with some of their adders, I think they're called. They're venomous, but they've done genetic augmentations and then measured the genetic difference over the years and determined that they were increasing the population. The population was, I have to look at the metrics, but it has been done, and it's been done for a number of animals. So it's really just the venomous, introducing a venomous animal in near a populated area. Now, the snakes are not in a downtown area, certainly, but they're not that far from the farthest moving animals to getting into neighborhoods, to getting into the edges of maybe a business or something. And why they're not that big of a threat, in my opinion, because they're just going to sit there. If somebody's dog ran out and was interested, certainly could kill the dog. Kids, so we want to balance that kind of what the reaction would be with what our kind of ability as a state agency, as a steward for the state's wildlife, what's the cost benefit and what's the risk. So it's just something that we need to look more into and really, I think, engage the public, because we don't want to get bad PR by doing things kind of in secret and then having something happen, and then that could really sink the agency or sink the program, or so we're trying to do it, but it's something I think we're dragging our feet on. I think we need to get going a little bit. That's all. And maybe that's I would like to do it tomorrow, right? But it's it's for our higher ups and for our for them to determine if it's okay and if they're willing to assume that added risk. But we move bears all the time. We move, we translocate bears, not all the time, but we do. There's been other animals that, are maybe not venomous, but they're moved around, and there's, maybe rabies vectors that are moved around sometimes, although those tend not to be moved. But so there is a risk for what we do. It's a wild animal, and it's not like we're introducing a non-native species or an invasive species. It's just a native snake. It's just another snake that has different genetics, but it's the same species. They were here before people got here. They should still be here. We can coexist with them. But people either love snakes or hate them. So, and who wants a snake in their backyard when they have a house and they don't like snakes and then add a venomous to it? So it's just something, and there's maybe we can do something with fencing. Maybe we can do something, there's other things, and there's lots of stuff that have been done in other communities around the country to prevent snakes from entering areas, to coexist with venomous snakes. It's a lot of evidence. It's just getting the momentum to do it that we need to do. And we're just losing time. So if there aren't any other questions, my business cards are back there. And for the people online, maybe we can put my email address on the. Okay. So if people have questions or they want to talk more, or if you want to report any sightings of other reptiles and amphibians, we talked just about rattlesnakes tonight, but a lot of our rare species records are from the public, and those are very important. The majority of our rare species records are from the public. So, and even common species, we track those as well and their distribution over the course of decades. So the more we have that long-term data, we can determine if populations are declining or not. So any reptile amphibian species you have questions about or you want to submit to me with location information and a photo, that's great. That goes right in our database, and that's used for reviewing, during our environmental review process. So we're protecting species. So you really, if you care about conservation, that's a huge thing that is needed and that can make a big difference.